Hi, it's Dr. Ron England here, and I'm going to take you through a step-by-step real project that I am actually doing in for a development of an application. First things first is that before I even start, an organization with a good developer or access to some good developers can do things that will save them incredible amounts of time and effort. So if you look at your organization and you look at the business processes that you do, and look at ways that you can streamline some of those business processes with basically software, this is a good example of a simple software project, relatively simple software project that can really make things a lot easier for your organization. So one, your organization is probably doing something right now that has a fairly complex process. I have a process here called outcome assessment, which is performed by every division in our organization does this, and it's essentially the same process, even though each organization does it differently. My division does it by creating spreadsheets and having people go in and fill in blanks inside of spreadsheets, and then each cycle that we're doing an assessment, because it's an assessment-based process, we make a copy of the last spreadsheet, and then we just modify the values, then aggregate the data by reading all those fields and bringing them to a central location and then using them. This is ripe for a development project that can actually streamline the entire thing. I'm going to make this an open source project. I'm going to complete the project, and I'm going to make it available not just to my organization, but to all organizations as an open source piece of software. I'm also using this for my class because I'm using this as an example of a .NET Core application. It's a web-based application. There's a couple things that you need to do a web-based application. One is a hosting environment. I'm going to use Azure for my hosting environment. I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2022. Really doesn't matter, but I'm using the Microsoft Entity Framework with code-first methodologies. I know from experience that that is a good way to do this type of application, even though there's plenty of ways to do it, because this doesn't have a backend database already built. If I was starting with a backend database already built, I might be looking at other solutions, but in this case, I can build the data model from what I know of the actual business process. So, step one is not coding. I know developers will be watching this and they're going to be like, I'm ready to jump in and start coding. This is a simple enough project that I can do it with a single developer, aka me, and actually do this in literally the span of a couple of days. So this is about a 20-hour project, roughly. Now, it's going to take me a lot longer because I'm going to be documenting every step of the project. So looking at the screen here, what I've done first is I've said, let's define what we do with our current process. And since we've been doing this current process, we've got a pretty good feel for what we do. Now, what I need to do is I need to take this process apart and look at the data model. What data is kept and how is that data used? Okay, let me say that again. What data is kept and how is that data used? That helps you build a data model. So what I'll immediately do is start taking that data model apart with the knowledge of the business process. I've documented the business process. It's relatively simple. It's actually all pretty much encapsulated in this little spreadsheet right here that I've put into my documentation. By the way, I start with documentation, not code. Again, I want to emphasize that you start documenting before you start coding, okay? Because you need to start defining the process of what you're doing and the data model that's associated with it. So from what I know, and I know this process relatively well, so it's really easy for me to write this, but it may take multiple people to sit down and start working your way through the data model. The beauty of this one is that since we're doing it, we've got what data we need to collect and how it's organized, so we can start building the data model. So in my data model, I've actually got multiple data models. And I've defined in my documentation how the different data models relate to each other. And what I do is I give a description of what each piece of data is and how it relates to the other data models. And these are actually data models. These would essentially be tables in a database, if you were to think of it that way. And that's actually a good way to think of it. Only when doing code first, you're going to build the data model first and let the data model build the tables. Okay, that's called code first methodology. There's that's not the only way, obviously, to do it. You can start with the data first and then go back to code. This is just going to work because that's the type of project that I'm doing. I may do a full case study of the exact opposite as I find an application that I need to write that is the opposite way. This is an application I'm writing in this direction, so this is the one that's getting documented. So I start building the actual data pieces of the data model. I define, like in this case, I define a data model called academic program, and I started going in there and saying, well, what does it have? In this case, title, description. It has relationships to other pieces of data. Some are one-to-one, some are one-to-many. I don't have any many-to-many right now. I can model many-to-many, but in this case, I'm not needing to because I don't have it. But when I see that a data model has a one-to-many relationship with another data model, I put that directly in the documentation with the notation of one-to-many. That tells me when I'm building this in code and I'm building the data models that I need to build those relationships in. I define all of these and I hopefully get them all done well. Once I've got them all built, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start coding them. Any specific business rules that I've got pertaining to this data model, I'm going to put into my documentation first before I start trying to code it, and I will have it in two different places. If it's business rules that pertain to a specific data model, it goes with the data model. If it's business rules that are specific to the entire application, I will have a specific place where I will put business rules that are application level business rules. The last thing that I do in here is I go ahead and write in my coding convention. Now, .NET Core Entity Framework using code first actually has an enforced coding convention. It tells you if your coding is not meeting the convention. So in the case of this application, I define that I'm using .NET Core Entity Framework using code first, and that defines my coding conventions right there. So that makes this whole part relatively easy. Okay, time spent on application at this stage. It took about 2 hours for me with knowledge of the business processes and the data to build this document so that I can start with the coding portion of the application. Next, we're going to go and start doing that portion in part 2. But part 1 is all about defining the project in documentation. Now, I'm going to have a lot more documentation in the code where it belongs. Documentation for things belongs close to what it's documenting. But this big overview of what I'm doing allows us to start. Now, this may take longer for somebody who does not have knowledge of the application and the business process involved, because they're going to have to sit down with somebody who knows the business process or has access to somebody who understands the business process. The other portion of this is with .NET Core Entity Framework and code first, you may not get all the data models perfect right from day one. Okay, that's okay, because that's why we've got migrations. Typically, we only want to do, and that data migrations are when you have to make modifications to the data model and then take those changes and migrate them to the back-end database that you're going to be using for the application. So this is step one. Do not skip this step. If you want a failed project, this is a good step to skip. If you want a successful project, this is a good step to put time and effort into. Okay, I'm talking to developers here, but I'm also talking to my students who will be doing this for a living. This is important. Your ability to document and your ability to communicate are one of the most important things you have as a developer. So you need to get those right. Okay, you're going to learn how to code. The technical sides of this are not that difficult. They're challenging, and there's challenging decisions to be made, but that's why you're a programmer, because you know how to do those things. But this part has got to be done correctly. This is open source. You have access to all of this. Links will be in the comments. Thank you very much, and we're going to move on to part 2, where we actually start setting up the project in Visual Studio. Good coding.